Why Freud says you're addicted to suffering and how to stop. There's a strange pattern that most of us never notice about ourselves. We keep ending up in pain not always because life throws it at us, but because, in a subtle, almost hidden way, we return to it. We ruminate over old wounds. We replay past regrets. We sabotage the good things. We choose partners who hurt us, jobs that drain us, behaviors that inevitably cycle back to disappointment. And then we wonder, why does this keep happening to me? But what if you're not just experiencing suffering? What if you're addicted to it? Freud believed that humans are not purely rational creatures. Beneath our conscious mind lives a subterranean world of instincts, compulsions, and unresolved conflicts. And in that world, suffering isn't just a byproduct of life, it's a pattern, a loop, a psychological addiction. He introduced the idea of the repetition compulsion, a drive within us to unconsciously recreate the same painful scenarios over and over again, often in slightly different forms, in the hope that this time we'll master it, that this time we'll finally win. But we never do. Because we're not solving the problem, we're reliving it. Let's break it down. Imagine a child who grows up feeling neglected. That absence of love, that feeling of invisibility, becomes part of their emotional blueprint. As an adult, they might consciously crave healthy love, but unconsciously, they're drawn to people who ignore them. Why? Because familiarity feels safe, not good, not joyful, just known. And the psyche would rather stay in known pain than risk the unknown joy that might come with change. That's the twisted genius of the unconscious. It traps you with your own history, and suffering becomes your comfort zone. But Freud takes this even deeper. He suggests that suffering serves a hidden function. It gives the ego something to do. It gives it purpose. When we suffer, we feel important, tragic, noble, like the protagonist of a grand drama. And in a weird way, it gives us an identity. Think about how often we define ourselves through our pain. I'm the one who was betrayed. I'm the one who never succeeds. I'm the one who always gets hurt. These stories become tattoos on the soul. And without realizing it, we start to need them to feel real.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more topics you love.
That's the addiction. Not just to pain itself, but to what pain gives us. A sense of self, a sense of control, a sense of continuity. But here's the paradox. The more we cling to suffering to feel real, the more we lose who we truly are. We become characters in a script written by our trauma. We act out scenes we didn't choose, and we call it personality, when it's actually memory. So the real question becomes, are you living your life or just repeating your past in disguise? That Freud didn't say this to shame us. He said it to wake us up. Because once you see the pattern, you have a chance to break it. But first, you have to be brutally honest with yourself. Where in your life are you choosing pain because it feels familiar? Where are you rejecting peace because it feels boring? Where are you reenacting your childhood in your adult relationships, your career choices, your inner dialogue? And here's the kicker. It's not enough to just notice the pattern. You have to be willing to lose the identity that suffering gave you. But that's terrifying. Because if you're not the victim anymore, who are you? If you're not struggling, what do you do with your energy? If you stop hurting, what fills the silence? That's why most people stay stuck, not because they're weak, but because they're afraid of what comes next. They're afraid of peace, of joy, of freedom. Because those things require a whole new self, a self that's never been tested, a self that's never been proven, a self that doesn't yet have a story. But that's exactly where the healing begins, in the space beyond the story. In the gap between who you've been and who you're becoming. Freud's insight wasn't just about diagnosing the problem, it was about giving you the power to rewrite the script. Because suffering can be a teacher. But at some point you have to graduate. You have to stop repeating the lesson and start living the truth. So I'll leave you with this question: what would your life look like if you no longer needed pain to feel alive? Not in theory, but right now. What would change? Who would you become? And what chapter would finally begin if you had the courage to close the one that's been hurting you for years? The pleasure trap, why your brain craves pain more than happiness, and how Freud proved it. It seems impossible at first. How could any sane person choose pain over pleasure? How could we, as intelligent beings, repeatedly walk back into suffering, even when happiness is within reach? Freud saw this contradiction not as madness, but as a defining feature of the human psyche. And what he uncovered is disturbing because it forces us to confront a truth most of us spend our lives avoiding. We don't actually want happiness as much as we say we do. At least, not all of us. Not all of the time. We want what's familiar. And for far too many of us, what's familiar is pain. Freud challenged the simple idea that people are motivated by the pursuit of pleasure. While that may be true on the surface, he argued that underneath our conscious desires lies a more primitive, complex force, the death drive or thanatos. It's the compulsion toward repetition, destruction, and ultimately, the return to a kind of inner zero state. It's the part of us that sabotages joy, picks fights for no reason, relives old wounds, and destroys the very things we claim to want. It's not logical, it's not rational, but it's real, and Freud saw it everywhere in patients, in culture, in himself. Let's look at this through a modern lens. You've probably known someone, or maybe been someone who finally gets into a healthy relationship and then slowly starts picking it apart, looking for flaws, creating distance, stirring up drama. Why? Because the nervous system doesn't recognize peace. It recognizes struggle. It relaxes into chaos. Calm feels foreign, unsafe. And so the brain, in its own twisted way, creates pain to restore what it knows. Pain becomes the baseline, and anything that deviates from that, any true contentment, any gentle joy, feels like a threat. This is the pleasure trap. We think we're chasing happiness, but we're actually chasing the emotional home we grew up with. And if that home was filled with tension, criticism, rejection, or silence, then that's what we recreate again and again. Not because we're broken, but because we've been conditioned. Freud's genius was in revealing that what feels right emotionally is not always what's good for us. It's simply what our unconscious mind has labeled as normal. And here's where it gets even deeper. Freud argued that the unconscious mind doesn't care about your goals, your dreams, or even your sanity. It cares about completion, resolution, closure. If you were abandoned as a child, your unconscious will try to recreate that abandonment in your adult life, not to hurt you, but in the hope that this time it will be different. This time, the person will stay. This time you'll win. But in doing so, you fall into the trap of repeating pain over and over again, waiting for a different outcome that never comes. It's like trying to finish a song that never had an ending. So what do we do? How do we escape this cycle? Freud's answer wasn't simple, but it was clear. We must bring the unconscious into consciousness. We must drag those hidden drives into the light and see them. See how we choose pain disguised as love. See how we chase validation dressed up as ambition. See how we push away happiness because we don't feel worthy of it. The only way out is through awareness. Because once you see the trap, you can stop walking into it. But awareness alone isn't enough. We have to retrain the nervous system. Literally. We have to teach ourselves that peace is safe, and that joy isn't a setup, that love doesn't have to hurt. And that takes practice. It takes sitting in moments of happiness without sabotaging them. It takes noticing when you're about to create conflict and choosing stillness instead. It takes saying, "This feels unfamiliar, but that doesn't mean it's wrong." It takes repetition in the opposite direction, a conscious rewiring of what we call normal. So ask yourself this: where in your life are you choosing pain because it feels more real than happiness? What would it look like to reverse that pattern, not by force, but by awareness? What would happen if you stopped chasing completion through suffering and instead allowed joy to feel like home? Escape the loop, how to break the cycle of emotional addiction, and finally heal. Once we see the pattern, once we acknowledge that suffering has become more than just a feeling and has turned into a familiar addiction, the question becomes urgent. How do we break free? How do we stop running the same internal script that lures us back to pain again and again? Freud gave us the diagnosis, but the path to healing requires more than theory. It demands a kind of inner rebellion, a decision to stop letting the unconscious run the show. And that starts with a shift so subtle, most people miss it. You must become the observer, not the actor. Emotional addiction is like a psychological loop. Something triggers an old wound, and we react not to the present, but to the echo of the past. The brain, wired by years of repetition, floods us with chemicals that make the pain feel familiar, even comfortable. And we respond in the same way we always have: anger, withdrawal, shame, blame, sabotage. And the loop completes, and we feel powerless, as if we were never in control to begin with. But here's the truth: you are not your reaction. You are the one who notices the reaction. That's the first crack in the loop. That's where healing begins. The moment you can pause and say, "Ah, I see it. This is the old pattern playing out," you've already changed the game. And that gap between stimulus and response, that's where your freedom lives. Freud believed that bringing the unconscious into the light was the key to transformation. And in real life, that often looks like sitting with discomfort without acting on it, but without numbing it, without turning it into a story, just witnessing it like a storm passing through. Yes, it hurts. But every time you do this, you're pulling energy out of the pattern. You're weakening its grip. But let's be honest, it's not enough to just not suffer. You can't white-knuckle your way to peace. You need something to move toward, not just something to run from. But that's where most people get stuck. They try to quit emotional pain like quitting a bad habit, but they don't replace it with something better. But nature hates a vacuum. So if you're going to stop feeding your pain, you must start feeding your growth. That means building new emotional muscles, learning to tolerate joy without suspicion, practicing gratitude even when your mind offers you reasons to complain, opening to love when your instincts tell you to retreat. And it also means doing something radical, forgiving yourself for the ways you've stayed stuck, and for the years lost to patterns you didn't even know you were in, and for the relationships you ruined because you were still living from your wounds. And Freud understood that healing often brings guilt, because when we become conscious of our self-sabotage, it's easy to turn that awareness into shame. But that's just another trap, another loop. The point is not to judge yourself. The point is to wake up, to become so radically aware of your patterns that they can no longer quietly define your life. So here's the practice: become obsessed with your own freedom. Notice your emotional defaults, interrupt them, replace them, not with perfection, but with presence. Ask yourself each day, in each moment of choice, is this a move toward freedom or a move back into the loop? And don't expect instant transformation. This is not a switch. It's a retraining of the nervous system, a reprogramming of the emotional brain. And every time you make a different choice, even a small one, you're breaking the cycle. Most importantly, don't do this alone. Freud knew that the unconscious is slippery. It resists exposure. That's why therapy works. That's why having conscious people in your life matters. You need mirrors. You need people who can lovingly say, "You're doing it again," without shaming you. You need environments that reward growth, not drama. Because healing doesn't just happen in the mind, it happens in relationship, in community, in the quiet rewiring of how you experience the world. So ask yourself, what would my life look like if I stopped mistaking emotional chaos for passion? Who would I be if I built my identity around peace instead of pain, presence instead of reaction? What becomes possible when I stop running the same emotional program and start writing a new one? The final release, parentheses. Why letting go of your old self is the key to ending suffering forever. There comes a point in every inner journey when we no longer need more insight, we need a release, a letting go. Not just of people or situations, but of a deeper attachment, the idea of who we think we are. Freud understood this better than most. He believed that much of our suffering isn't caused by external events, but by our resistance to change, especially the change of identity. We cling to the self we've built through years of pain, defense mechanisms, and stories. But to truly heal, we must be willing to let that self die. And that's terrifying. Because your old self has kept you safe, familiar, predictable. It's the version of you that knows how to navigate suffering, even if it means staying small, anxious, or unfulfilled. That self is the product of every adaptation you made to survive. But survival is not the same as living. And the space between the two is where transformation waits. To cross it, you must ask, am I willing to let go of who I've been to become who I've never known? Letting go doesn't mean forgetting your past. It means no longer letting the past define your choices. It means releasing your grip on the belief that pain is your destiny. It means saying, thank you to the self that got you here, and then gently setting it down. The ego will resist. It will scream. It will tell you that you're nothing without your suffering. But that's the final illusion. You are not your wounds. You are not your fears. You are the awareness that sees them, the presence that survives them, the consciousness that can rewrite everything. The moment you stop needing your old identity, something strange happens. You begin to feel lighter, not because your problems vanish, but because your attachment to them dissolves. You start to respond to life rather than react. You stop chasing validation and start expressing truth. You stop asking, what if I fail? And start asking, what if I'm free? And in that space, suffering loses its grip not because it stops appearing, but because it no longer sticks. So here's the final invitation: let it go. Let go of the story that says you're broken. Let go of the idea that you have to earn happiness through suffering. Let go of the identity that's been built on proving something to people who were never watching. Let go of the version of you that was just trying to survive. And in that release, feel the power of something ancient, something timeless, your true self rising from underneath it all. Because healing isn't about fixing yourself. It's about remembering yourself, the self before the pain, with the self that exists beyond the loop, the self that doesn't need suffering to feel real. So ask yourself now, if I stop being who I've always been, who could I finally become? That's not the end, that's the beginning.